Now, on to the main event, the address by Bryan Stevenson. This is a man who has had an exceptional impact on the world. As the founder of the Equal Justice Initiative, Mr. Stevenson has dedicated his life to fighting poverty and challenging the legacy of poverty and racial discrimination in the American criminal justice system. His best-selling book, Just Mercy, tells the stories of some of his cases. They include children who have been persecuted as adults and innocent death row prisoners who have been wrongly condemned. Recently, his organization opened a museum built on the site of a former slave warehouse in Montgomery, Alabama. It's called the Legacy Museum, From Enslavement to Mass Incarceration. Nearby is the Equal Justice Initiative's National Memorial to Victims of Lynching, called the National Memorial of Peace and Justice. It is my honor and my privilege to introduce Mr. Bryan Stevenson.
Thank you so much. It is such a great honor to be here with you today. I have so much respect for this institution. Johns Hopkins is an amazing university. It's an amazing institution. And to you graduates, I just want to say congratulations to you for what you have achieved. Today, you will get a degree that confirms and legitimates and affirms the hard work that you have done over the last 4 years. But I also believe that today your degree will do something else. I think your degree now authorizes you to change the world. And I say that with all sincerity. I believe that you've done something really remarkable by achieving what you've achieved. I believe you've done something extraordinary by completing your course of study, but there is something greater yet for you to do. We need you to leave this university with high expectations about what you can do to create a more just world. And I'm really serious. I hope you will help find ways to change things. I work in the criminal justice space, and I've seen what happens when graduates become indifferent to the problems that they see around them. In 1972, we had 300,000 people in jails and prisons. Today, we have 2.3 million people in jails and prisons. The United States now has the highest rate of incarceration in the world. We've got 6 million people on probation or parole. There are 70 million Americans with criminal arrests, which means that when they try to get jobs or try to get loans, they're often disfavored. We've done terrible things to women. Over the last quarter century, over the last 25 years, the percentage of women going to prison has increased 646%. 70% of the women we send to jails and prisons are single moms with minor children, which means that when these moms go to jails and prisons, the lives of these children get disrupted. We do terrible things to people when they come out of jails and prisons. We disenfranchise them, we exclude them, we won't employ them. The statistic that keeps me up latest at night is the one from the Bureau of Justice. The Bureau of Justice now predicts that 1 in 3 black male babies born in this country is expected to go to jail or prison during his lifetime. The statistic for Latino boys is 1 in 6. And there is this stunning silence and indifference. There aren't enough people trying to change the world, to disrupt this despair. I go into poor communities where 13-year-old children tell me they expect to go to jail or prison. And so for me, there is this need to change things. And whether we're talking about the criminal justice system or the environment, or whether we're talking about how we deal with the status of women, or we deal with immigration, or we deal with international security, I need you, we need you, to become graduates who are committed to changing the world. And there are 4 things I believe you have to do if you want to change the world. The first thing is that you have to find ways, no matter what your field of study, doesn't matter whether you're an engineer or a teacher or a nurse or practitioner, whatever you do, you have to find ways, in whatever community you live, to get proximate to people who are suffering, to get closer to people who are excluded, to go into the parts of the community that other people say you shouldn't go to. Many of us grew up in communities where people would say to us, oh, that's the bad part of town. Stay as far away from that part of town as possible. Today, I'm going to urge you to do the opposite. We need a class of graduates from this institution that looks for ways to get closer to the poor, the marginalized, the excluded, the incarcerated, those who are dealing with inequality and injustice, and in proximity to the poor and the disfavored. I believe whatever you've studied, whatever you're trying to do, your commitment to doing it will be deepened. There is power in proximity. And no matter where you go, if you find ways to get past the barriers that exclude those who are disfavored, and you get proximate, you'll discover something transformative. I learned about proximity not from my time as a lawyer, not from my graduate study. I learned about it from my grandmother. I told the group last night I had a remarkable, extraordinary grandmother. My grandmother was the classic African-American matriarch. She was tough, she was strong, she could be intimidating. My grandmother was the end of every argument in our family. My grandmother was also the start of a lot of arguments in our family. And she had these tactics and things that she would do. And when I was a little boy, my grandmother would come up to me and she'd give me these hugs and she'd squeeze me so tightly, I thought she was trying to hurt me. And then she'd see me an hour later and she'd look at me and she'd say, "Bryan, do you still feel me hugging you?" And if I said no, she would jump on me again. And by the time I was 10, my grandmother had taught me every time I would see her, the first thing I would say is, "Mama, I always feel you hugging me." And she'd smile this smile, and I didn't appreciate what she was doing until I got much older. She lived to be in her 90s. She worked as a domestic her whole life. And one day she fell down and she broke her hip, she developed cancer, and she was dying. And I was a college student when she was on her deathbed, and I went to see my grandmother, and I was just pouring my heart out because she meant the world to me. She was so important to me, and I was holding her hand, saying everything I could think to say, and it was finally time for me to leave. And I stood up to leave. I didn't even think my grandmother could hear me. Her eyes were closed. But as I was about to leave, my grandmother opened her eyes and she squeezed my hand. And the last thing she said to me, she said, "Bryan, do you still feel me hugging you?" And then she said, "I'm always going to be hugging you." And I tell you that because if we get proximate to people who are suffering, people who are excluded, people who are neglected, people who are abused, we don't have to know all of the answers. We don't have to understand all of the complexities. We don't have to have all of the solutions. Sometimes we just have to be close enough to those who are struggling and wrap our arms around them and let them know that their humanity is recognized by us, that their life has meaning and purpose in proximity. We can embrace people who need to be embraced. There's such power that comes to us. I'm the product of someone's choice to get proximate. I grew up in a community where black children couldn't go to the public schools. In my county, there were no high schools for black children when my dad was a teenager. He couldn't go to high school in our county. And I remember when lawyers came into the community and made them open up the public schools so black kids like me could go to high school. I got to go to high school. I got to go to college. When I got to college, I come to Johns Hopkins, I see so many of you, and even sitting here, I can tell all of you are so much more cool than I was when I was in college. I was a really uncool college student. I would do these things in college that you're not supposed to do. When I got to college, I was so excited. I was very involved in music, I was very involved in sports, and I would go up to people because I was so excited, even if I didn't know them, and I'd say, "Hi, my name is Bryan Stevenson, and I love college." And people would look at me like I'm crazy. I went into the cafeteria one time, I sat down and I looked at these kids, I said, "Guess what? I love college. I'm gonna spend the rest of my life in college." And what I remember these kids doing is getting up and walking away from me. And I called my mom and said, "Mom, I've decided I'm gonna spend the rest of my life in college." My mom said, "You know, Bryan, I didn't go to college, but I don't think they're gonna let you do that." I said, "No, Mom, they will." And I was a philosophy major in college. So by the time I became a senior, I started thinking I better have some deep thoughts, and I started working on my deep thoughts, and then I realized nobody was gonna pay me to philosophize when I graduated from college. And so I tried to figure out how to stay in school, and because nobody in my family had gone to college, I didn't know what all of you know. I didn't know that in this country, if you want to do graduate work in history or English or political science, to get admitted to graduate school, you have to know something about history, English, or political science. I was very intimidated by that, so I kept looking, and to be honest, that's how I found my way to law school. It was very clear to me, you don't need to know anything to go to law school. You don't. So I signed up for that, and a few months later found myself sitting in a classroom at Harvard Law School, deeply disillusioned. Because I went there because I was concerned about racism and poverty and social injustice, and nobody was talking about poverty or race, and I got disillusioned. I decided to leave. I went over to the School of Government to get a degree in public policy, and I remember the day 2 months into that program when I woke up and I looked in the mirror and I thought, wow, I'm even more miserable here than I was at the law school. They were teaching us to maximize benefits and minimize costs, but it didn't seem to matter whose benefits got maximized and whose costs got minimized. And I went back to the law school, and I was about to do this thing I'm going to urge all of you not to do. I began to believe that the privilege of education was not that you get to make choices with your life. I began to rationalize accepting a career as a lawyer that I knew was not going to be fulfilling. I want to urge you to understand that the privilege of this degree is that you get to make choices with what you do with your life. You don't have to accept careers that don't animate your heart. You don't have to accept things that don't make you feel good about what you do each and every day. And in that moment of crisis, I couldn't figure out what to do, and I got proximate. I took a course that required me to spend a month representing people on death row, and it was in proximity to the condemned that I heard voices that I hadn't heard before. I saw things that I hadn't seen before. I learned that we had a criminal justice system that treats you better if you're rich and guilty than if you're poor and innocent. I saw poor people being crushed by inequality, and in proximity to it, I found my calling. I knew that I wanted to help condemned people get to a better place, and because I got proximate, when I got back to Harvard Law School, you couldn't get me out of the law school library. I needed to know everything, and I tell you that because proximity will empower you. It doesn't matter whether you're a doctor or an engineer, it doesn't matter whether you're a teacher or a nurse. If you get proximate, if you stay close to people who are suffering, if you learn things that reveal inequality, you will be empowered. We change the world when we choose not to isolate ourselves. But proximity won't be enough. The second thing you're going to have to do to change the world, you're going to have to change some of the narratives that are out there. We talk about the policies, we talk about the issues, but there are narratives underneath those policies and issues. We have mass incarceration in this country because we declared this misguided war on drugs. We said people who are drug dependent and people who are drug addicted, we said those people are criminals. Now, we didn't have to say that. We could have said that people with addiction and dependency have a health problem. We could have used our healthcare system to respond to that problem, but instead, we said, no, those are criminals, and now we've sent hundreds of thousands of people to jails and prisons. The reason why we did that, though, has to do with a narrative. We had politicians that were preaching to us what I call the politics of fear and anger. They wanted us to be afraid, and they wanted us to be angry. And if we allow ourselves to be governed by fear and anger, we'll tolerate inequality, we'll tolerate injustice. And so I believe we're going to have to change the narrative. We cannot be a community of people who are willing to be governed by fear and anger. Fear and anger are the essential ingredients of injustice and oppression and inequality. Go anywhere in the world where there's oppression. If you ask the people why they do what they do, they'll give you a narrative of fear and anger, and we're going to have to change some of these narratives. We're going to have to change the narratives that are out there. We're going to have to create a new kind of world, and in this new world we create, we're going to have to be adamant that people with disabilities should not be disfavored or excluded or pushed to the margins. In this new world, we're going to have to create a narrative that no woman should have to worry about harassment or sexual violence in the workplace. We're going to have to create a narrative that affirms the value of every human being. No person who's a religious minority, no person who is gay or lesbian, no person who is dismissed or excluded because of who they are can be tolerated. We're going to have to create a narrative that changes our relationship to the history of racial inequality that we've inherited in this country. You know, we're not free in this country. We're not. We're burdened by this history. And it's in the air, it's like smog, it's everywhere, and we've all breathed it in, and our parents and our grandparents and our great-grandparents should have changed the narrative, but they didn't, so that means we have to change the narrative. We're going to have to talk about some things that we haven't talked about before. I think we have to talk about the fact that we live in a post-genocide society. Before Europeans were on this continent, there were native people here, and the Europeans that came to this continent slaughtered millions of native people. They killed them through famine and war and disease. It was a genocide, but we didn't call it that. We said those native people are savages. We use this narrative of racial difference to justify the violence that we subjected native populations to. We forced them off their lands, and that narrative of racial difference, that became this part of who we are. That we just accepted. That narrative was crafted, and I believe it was that narrative that made American slavery so insidious. I don't think the great evil of American slavery was forced labor or involuntary servitude. I think the real evil of American slavery was this ideology that we created that black people aren't the same as white people. They're not fully evolved. They're not human. They can't do this. They can't do that. It was this ideology of white supremacy that was the true evil of American slavery. And If you read the 13th Amendment, it talks about ending involuntary servitude. It talks about ending forced labor, but it doesn't say anything about ending this narrative of racial difference. And because of that, I don't think slavery ended in America in 1865. I think it just evolved. It turned into decades where we had terrorism and lynchings, and people were pulled out of their homes, and they were drowned, and they were beaten. Not far from where we are sitting, black people were lynched, sometimes literally on the courthouse lawn, and we haven't talked about what that era of terrorism did to our demographic geography. The black people in Cleveland and Chicago and Detroit and in Los Angeles and Oakland didn't go to those communities as immigrants looking for new economic opportunities. They went to those communities as refugees and exiles from terror in the American South. And because we never dealt with that narrative, it continued, and even when we had this heroic civil rights movement, it was insufficient to change the narrative because we've accepted a narrative about the civil rights movement. I'm going to tell you that I think has gotten a little too celebratory. I hear people talking about the civil rights movement, and it's starting to sound like a 3-day carnival. On day 1, Rosa Parks didn't give up her seat on a bus. On day 2, Dr. King led a march on Washington. On day 3, we changed all the laws and racism was over, and I wish that was our history, but that's not our history. We did difficult things, terrible things. And because of that, today, that narrative of racial difference is still out there, and it breaks my heart to look out at this amazing class of graduates and have to say to the black and brown graduates sitting in this classroom, even though you have a Johns Hopkins degree, even though you've done remarkable work, even though you've been kind and working hard, even though you've had these great accomplishments, if you are black or brown, you will go places in this country where you may be presumed dangerous and guilty just because of your color. And until that changes, we cannot not accept the responsibility to change the world. We've got to change the world by changing these narratives. There's something better waiting for us than we've experienced in this country. And I want us to get there, but even changing the narratives is not going to be enough. We're going to have to get proximate, change narratives. The third thing you're going to have to do is you're going to have to stay hopeful. You cannot change the world if you allow yourself to become hopeless. I actually believe that hopelessness is the enemy of justice. Injustice prevails where hopelessness persists, and so you've got to find a way to stay hopeful. You either are hopeful or you're the problem. I hate saying it like that, but I really do believe it because your hope is your superpower. Hope will allow you sometimes to stand up when other people say sit down. Hope will allow you to speak when other people say be quiet. When you're hopeful, you can actually believe things and see things that other people can't see. When I moved to Montgomery, it was a city with 59 markers and monuments to the Confederacy. We celebrate Jefferson Davis's birthday as a state holiday. We celebrate Confederate Memorial Day as a state holiday. We don't have Martin Luther King Day in Alabama. We have Martin Luther King / Robert E. Lee Day. Our 2 largest high schools are Robert E. Lee High and Jefferson Davis High. And when I moved there, you could not find the word slave or slavery anywhere in that city. There was this indifference, this silence. And today, I want to invite all of you to come to Montgomery because today in Montgomery, we have this national memorial to peace and justice. We have a legacy museum that lifts up the voices of millions of people who were enslaved in this country. And when you come with hope, you begin to see things. And I will tell you, that museum and memorial was built by a lot of hard work, a lot of hard research. It took donations, but mostly it was the hope of some of us who believed that we could change the narrative in this country. And when I'm there, sometimes I feel what that hope can give me. I'll be honest, I've been in that museum, I've been in the memorial, and it could feel like sometimes that I hear the spirits of enslaved people, spirits of people who were lynched, people who were segregated and disfavored, the people who were incarcerated, and sometimes what I hear them saying is, stay hopeful, your work is not yet done. Hope is critical to your capacity to change the world. And Havel said, the kind of hope you need is not pie in the sky. It's not a preference for optimism over pessimism. He said it's an orientation of the spirit, a willingness to sometimes be in hopeless places and be a witness. Fourth and finally, if we're going to change the world, we're going to have to be proximate, change narratives, stay hopeful. But the fourth and final thing you're going to have to do is be willing to do things that are inconvenient and uncomfortable. And I hate saying that, because it's difficult to do things that are inconvenient and uncomfortable because we're human. And humans are biologically and psychologically programmed to do what's comfortable, what's convenient, but to change the world, you're going to have to do inconvenient things, uncomfortable things. And don't get me wrong, I'm not against comfort. That's not what I'm saying. I gave a talk down in Mississippi. The people met me at the airport. They said, oh, Mr. Stevenson, we know all about you. We know what kind of lawyer you are. We know what kind of work you do. We read your book. And they said, Mr. Stevenson, we're having our conference at the luxurious DoubleTree Hotel. They said, we decided that you would not want to stay at the luxurious DoubleTree Hotel. They said, we've asked one of the farmers to put you up at the barn. I said, what is wrong with you? I said, of course I want to stay in the luxurious DoubleTree Hotel. I like those chocolate chip cookies just like everybody else. That's not what I'm talking about. No, what I'm talking about is that sometimes you have to position yourself in uncomfortable places. And I'm here as a witness that when you do it, even though it may be difficult, even though it may be intimidating, there is something magical, something powerful that happens on the other side of it. You know, this was taught to me by an older man. I was giving a talk in a church. And this older man came into the back of the church. He was in a wheelchair, older black man. And I was giving my talk, but this older man in the back was staring at me with this stern, angry look on his face. I couldn't figure out, why is he looking at me so sternly? He looked angry. And I got through my talk, and people were very nice and appropriate. They came up to me, but that older black man was sitting at the back, still staring. And finally, when everybody else left, this older black man wheeled himself to the front of the church. And when he got in front of me, he put his hand up. He had that stern look on his face. And he got in front of me, and he looked up at me, and he said, do you know what you're doing? And I just stood there. And then he asked me again, he said, do you know what you're doing? And I stepped back, and I mumbled something. I don't even remember what I said. Then he asked me again, he said, do you know what you're doing? And then this older man looked at me, and he said, I'm going to tell you what you're doing. And this man looked at me, and he said, you're beating the drum for justice. You keep beating the drum for justice. And I was so moved. I was also really, really relieved, because I just didn't know what was about to happen. And then this man grabbed me by my jacket, and he pulled me into his wheelchair. He said, come here, come here, come here, I'm going to show you something. And this older black man turned his head. He said, you see this scar I have behind my right ear? He says, I got that scar in Greene County, Alabama, 1963, trying to register people to vote. He turned his head. He said, you see this cut I have down here at the bottom of my neck? He said, I got that cut in Philadelphia, Mississippi, 1964, trying to register people to vote. He turned his head. He said, you see this dark spot? He said, that's my bruise. Got my bruise in Birmingham, Alabama, 1965, trying to register people to vote. Then he looked at me. He said, I'm going to tell you something, young man. He said, people look at me, they think I'm some old man sitting in a wheelchair covered with cuts and bruises and scars. He looked at me, he said, but I'm going to tell you something. He said, these are not my cuts. He said, these are not my bruises. He said, these are not my scars. He said, these are my medals of honor. I tell you that because I believe that we can do something transformative. I believe really simple things. I believe that each of us is more than the worst thing we've ever done. I believe if someone tells a lie, they're not just a liar. If they take something, they're not just a thief. I think even if you kill someone, you're not just a killer, and justice requires that we know the other things you are before we judge you. I am persuaded that in this country, the opposite of poverty is not wealth. We talk too much about money sometimes. I am persuaded that in this country and around the world, the opposite of poverty isn't wealth. I believe the opposite of poverty is justice. And when we do justice, we deconstruct the conditions that give rise to poverty. And finally, I believe if we're going to change the world, if we're going to create a new future, if we're going to use these degrees to allow things to change that must be changed, we have to accept that we cannot measure how we're doing by looking at how well we treat privileged people and powerful people and celebrated people. Our commitment to changing the world is going to have to be reflected in how we treat poor people, incarcerated people, neglected people, disfavored people. It's in that context that we change the world. And so, I just want you to remember that when you leave here today, nothing will determine your ability to change the world more than your heart. Your grades are not a measure of your capacity to change the world. Your income will not be a measure of your capacity to change the world. What will allow you to change the world is if you let the ideas in your mind be fueled by some conviction in your heart. The degree you receive today is so wonderful, so meritorious, so appropriate that we applaud you. But if you take that degree and you find ways to get proximate, if you find ways to change narratives, if you stay hopeful and you do uncomfortable things, you can put that degree on the wall. And in a few years, that degree won't just be a degree. It will be your medal of honor as a Hopkins graduate who is changing the world. I wish you to it, and thank you for all you've done. Thank you.